The great Christian mystic, St. John of the Cross. That's who I'm speaking about today on the Lenses That Liberate podcast. Hey everybody, Derek here, and welcome back to the Lenses That Liberate podcast. Today I'm speaking with Kimberly Braun. Kimberly was a nun in the Carmelite order for about 11 years or so, and since a young age has been very, very interested in the teachings of St. John of the Cross. So today we're going to go into that in some depth, dropping into the transmission, speaking about different aspects of his life and how it's applicable to our modern times. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kimberly Braun. So good morning, Kimberly. It's lovely to have you here with me.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
So today we're going to be chatting about and really dropping into the transmission of St. John of the Cross. So St. John was a Christian mystic from the 16th century who I believe spent all of his life in Spain. He's known for his works of the Dark Night of the Soul, the Ascent of Mount Carmel, and by many as the Doctor of Detachment. So we're going to really drop into his transmission today and explore some of his teachings. So maybe to begin with, Kimberly, you could say a little bit about your background, about how you found St. John and your relationship with him.
Sure. Thank you. I stumbled into a relationship with John. I have had the true grace for most of my conscious years to experience illuminative moments with God, with the divine, with spirit. Nowadays, all those words are so blown open for me that they point to something that's quite wordless. And in the high and low moments of my life, in the places that are comfortable within me and uncomfortable within me. And in my late teens, I was beginning to experience what I would say the only language I could find would be like from the hound of heaven, which is something in some Christian works of really being pursued by God.
That's a beautiful phrase. The hound of heaven.
Yes.
That's gorgeous.
Yeah. And I couldn't have said no to it if I had wanted, and I didn't want to because I'm such a lover archetype, but it took me into so many places of endearing joy. And I was taken into hours and hours in deep ecstasy and bliss. And with that was extraordinary phenomena, but that's very less important to me. What was important was I was seeing that I was coming alive. I was integrating and coming into wholeness, places within me where I had trauma or separation or anything that needed to be healed was coming into active healing just in this solitude, in this divine embrace. And in my late teens in Santa Cruz, California, I was looking for a spiritual director. It was more here that I was looking than here. I didn't doubt the veracity of what was happening. It was impossible. There was too much good fruit that was happening. But I knew it was a smart thing to have a mentor in these kinds of experiences and what was happening with my life. But I couldn't find anybody. I couldn't find anybody that could relate to anything I was trying to say or understood it. And in my own lack of self-confidence, in my own threads of low self-esteem, I figured, well, of course, here I am, this young teenager, and I probably came off as really immature. And my self-judgment was like, well, of course they wouldn't think this was of God. I mean, look at me. That was my attitude. But I gave up. I gave up on trying to even talk about it. I was in a small circle of friends that were experiencing a lot of dynamic change. but no one was experiencing this inner explosion in this way.
Mm.
And they were all so much older than me. So again, I was hesitant to try to share these things. So when I gave up, though, it was a tremendous gift. I didn't know that at the time, because within a week, a housemate put in my lap the autobiography of Teresa of Avila, and I started to read it, and it was Kieran Kavanagh's translation, and so it's very archaic. He's more of a literal translator. We have translators today like Mirabai Starr and many other teachers that put it into parlance that's easy to
Yeah.
understand today. But I loved the literal because it was closest to how she would have said things. And I felt her presence so clear as you and I, that I didn't really need a mediator between me and her words. And I was weeping as I was reading it because I was having the same experiences as her. And what happened after that, my second friend that opened up, another Carmelite, was Therese of Lisieux. Somebody put her story of a soul, her autobiography, into my hands. And again, I read that within one night, and it burned like a fire in my heart, so much so that I could quote the book anywhere. Thick book. I could, one reading, finished it like 2 a.m., and I could quote her anywhere. And then the third person that fell into my lap was John. And it was actually this book of poetry. It wasn't even another work of his. And it was through a man that I had started to date. And it was all wrong. Our dating was all wrong because I was so called to be Carmelite. But we had this connection. We had the dark night of the soul connection. So in my head, I was like, oh, great. I'm meeting a guy that, no, not at all. And I was much more of a contemplative than he was. He was much more of a scholar. And John opened up to me a path of tenderness. He is very often misunderstood because his way is the via negativa. You mentioned the doctor of detachment. He is seen as the one that is most severe, much more severe than most all Carmelites. And yet I found in him a tenderness, a real sweetness, a gentle, all-penetratingness that I didn't experience even in Teresa of Avila. I would say I experienced it in Therese. And so that's where my friendship started with John, was this real sweetness. And he gave a language to the poetry of my making love with God that I didn't find in anybody else. So he could celebrate and give words to what I, at that time, even though I loved to express and write, at that time I really didn't have hardly any words. I have a few poems, but I really couldn't write anything down. So that was my entry point to him. It was that simple. And it was from there, with those three friendships, that my friendship with Carmelites broadened naturally. I didn't even seek them out. Elizabeth of the Trinity and Teresa of the Andes and Titus Franzmann, Edith Stein, the Jewish scholar who became Carmelite and gave her life in the Holocaust. And all these people formed my community, and so it was natural to join the Carmelite monastery. And they painted for me a picture that was exactly what I experienced. And that's a picture of being in the embrace and being fully in the world, because monastic life is not a life void of human darkness and weakness. It's actually a place where that's all magnified, just like the human greatness, because the simplicity opens that all up to a great transparency. We see things as they are when we're in silence, if we're open. So that was it. And I spent 10 and a half years as a Carmelite. And I would say in some ways, I'm still very Carmelite. That's still an energy signature. but in other ways, I'm not at all. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, so you were speaking about silence there, and here's a couple of quotes from John that maybe we can delve into for a little bit. He says, "The soul that is quick to turn to speaking and conversing is slow to turn to God." And here,
Yes.
and here's another one. He says, "It is best to learn to silence the faculties and to cause them to be still, so that God may speak."
Yes. And another one that I love as well is God has spoken one word, and that word is his son, Christ. I take that out of gender, son, daughter, Christ.
Mm.
And it is in silence alone that we can hear that word reverberating. I am with you. I find silence to be the place where life giving communication actually happens. So while it can have a twofold process of moving away from something, it is fully at the service to experience the fullness of that. I would say that even our words on a very mundane level, what are they? They're symbols, right?
Mm.
And in as much as they're aligned with truth, they're symbols that can open an opportunity to experience truth. But they're simply symbols. They're not it. So I love that. I love that word silence. And I love serving people to come to a new relationship with themselves in silence. What about you? What's silence for you?
Yeah, I've spent so much of probably my 20s. I'm in my late 30s now, and a lot of it at retreats. And I really started to learn over the years when I spent a lot of time in silence that it was the silence itself out of which all of the transfiguration or change would really happen for me. And over the years, I've slowly learned to lean into it more, to take more time resting in it. And here's a beautiful quote from John that I really think speaks to me around it. He says, "Who teaches the soul if not God?" And God for me is that silence, you know,
Right.
being
Yeah.
able to learn to get the depth of that transmission and have it flow through into what he's calling the soul and then into the personality from there, you know.
I even making that super practical, like taking that into a an example that we all have experienced. I'm such a believer that all insight, union, transformation happens in silence, that I find you can even point to these little moments when a light bulb goes off, maybe even in a work day or taking care of children or working on a project. I think if we went down the rabbit hole and came to the moment when the brilliance came forward, it was a moment when there was a gap
Mm.
between filling it with other ideas. And I just recently had a hardcore engineer on one of my retreats. And it took about 4 or 5 days into the retreat. I actually wasn't trying to make this point. It was coming up in him. He he was making a practical example that he would work with others on a problem engineering, working away at the problem, working away until they came up with the solution. And he said, so how then is inspiration coming from silence in that? And I said, I bet if you expanded the conversation and the inquiry that went even into that really practical problem, I bet you would find there would be a moment of open receptivity, a moment of breath, a moment of breakthrough that would happen. And if you went even further, like if you were editing like a music track and you kind of expanded far, far, far apart so that the every little movement of sound is like exaggerated, that you would find that the real solution to the problem happened in a moment of silence. Because even if I hear your words and I'm moved, your words happen and then there's a breath, there's a gap, there's a There's a something of the unknown that happens in which I'm alighted or inspired. So I think silence is the only place wherein all that genius and transformation happens.
It's beautiful. Yeah, the way I've been thinking about it the last few years is being able to be informed about what we do from the inside out. So we're really connected to something else. And it really is a real shift of our attention to learn to take from the deepest impulse inside of us versus from the surface one. And I want to read you a quote here from St. John, because something that I think is often misinterpreted, and understandably so, because it's quite an unusual phrase to say around denying yourself. And let's just speak about this for a second. So he says, if you do not learn to deny yourself, you will make no progress in perfection.
Yes. Don't you love that? And
Mm.
it's scary. It's scary because we don't know what's on the other side of that denial. You probably have these quotes, but to parlay on that,
Yeah.
he's got a quote that says, if you desire to possess everything, if you want to possess everything, desire to possess nothing.
Mm.
And for me, when he speaks about denial, it is in the service of the possession of that for which we long. Um, I've always found when others read a quote like you just shared
Mm.
about the denying self, they take it out of context. John, from such a young age, was predisposed to this direct connection with the desire of his soul for union. From the youngest recollections, we've got accounts of stories where Mary appears to help him out of a well, and where his natural turning is towards that which gives him consolation. And so when we pull his negative um, admonitions or advice, the little tidbits of advice, we can miss the fact that he's already inflamed. Think about, like, what I love to think about is just being in love with somebody, or being in love with something, a person, the mountains, whatever. And when you're in love, you're just like, I've got to have it. I've got to have it. So whenever I read John, I feel I've got to have it. I've got to have it all. I want it all.
Mm.
And in that felt sense that comes from this deep desire of his soul, from that he's like, get out of my way. In the spiritual canticle, he says, oh, crystal brook, would that you would show me the eyes for which I long. Send me no more messengers that cannot give me what I want.
Mm.
But it happens because he feels this trace, this fragrance of the beloved in the crystal brook. The crystal brook is alive with this presence, but it's not it. And I so love that about him. No.
Yeah, my sense is when in the Christian teachings, when people are speaking about deny thyself, it's like there probably was back in those times, the 15th, 16th century, and probably for a long time beforehand, a sense of denial of parts of ourselves that was not healthy, around sexuality, around impulses and things. But at the same time, I feel like when I hear that phrase, he's really speaking about to deny our surface impulses, to deny our immediate impulse, to sit still a little longer, to not move with the first impulse of mind or the first impulse of the senses. And if we stay there and we burn in that a little bit, as you were saying, that we discover something much deeper about it. And in that sense, the surface denial of our surface impulses really serves our deeper self. So in a certain sense, it really isn't a denial at all. It's really a coming into a much fuller version of ourselves.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. That's really lovely. And I believe that's so true. And even, you're right, because he did a lot of penance. He did it. I mean, he would not allow people to do the level of penance that he did. And that can add to this impression that he felt unworthiness, or a need to make reparation. And I don't really know why he did all that penance. I know it was cultural. It would have been the normal. When you think about the Spanish Inquisition and all the turmoil in Spain in general, he was in a time when being in the world was not so pleasant. There was a lot of oppression happening, a lot of killing happening, and he is a guy of his times. We're people of our times. We're influenced, and yeah, and it's possible to recognize that and not misinterpret where his motives are when he says the word deny or negate, because his poem of the enamored soul is this proclamation towards the end of his life. Mine are the heavens, mine is the earth. All peoples are mine. All angels are mine. The stars are mine. The sky is mine. He makes this proclamation that it's all his now, and that can't then validate any idea that he believes this life in the body, this life isn't meant to be filled with the illumination of God.
And that's gorgeous. Yeah, there's another quote here I have, and he's speaking about wretchedness, and maybe we can tease that out a little bit too, because like you're saying, where he's talking about there's something so healthy about noticing our egoic flaws and being in a sense of a healthy penance, which is staying and burning in them and opening, versus turning it into some method of beating ourselves up or turning upon ourselves in some way that doesn't actually serve our evolution. And here's a phrase from him. He says, "Strive always to confess your sins with a deep knowledge of your own wretchedness and with clarity and purity."
Yes, yes. And I think if we looked at his Spanish, I don't want to minimize the dramatic statement in the English,
Yeah,
because that's really uncomfortable for us in our American culture, where we suffer from low self-esteem more often than not.
exactly.
Uh,
And to
so,
make that distinction clearer, that that's not where he's coming from around you should develop low self-esteem in any way, right?
right, it's
Yeah.
the opposite. It's the ability, if you look at his life as an example, a lot of his poetry and writings are lyrical. He was a great writer, considered one of the best poets in Spain
Mm,
still today. And he draws upon the lyrical, playful kind of tavern songs, for lack of a better word, like minstrel songs. And so a lot of times his turn of a phrase is to laugh, be able to laugh at himself. Be able
beautiful.
to say,
Yeah.
"Oh, I'm so wretched. I am so not
Mm,
it. I am so not God." And I can relate to it. When I entered the monastery, now this is me. I don't support this as a healthy practice. It's my illumination from what our practices were. We did a lot of practices where we were acknowledging our faults, and they were more dramatic. Think about, like, if you failed to put the milk back in the refrigerator, and then you saw your housemate and you got down on your knees and you kissed the floor and you said, "I'm so sorry, I forgot to put the milk back in the refrigerator." Like
that's the
that.
kind of thing you were doing, is it?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. So now, if you did that in our society, that would come off as really, like, degrading.
Mm,
And I remember when I was first introduced to the practice, I didn't buck against it. I didn't have a egoic reaction, but I had a worry that it was not commensurate with the fault, that the level of acknowledgement of the fault wasn't commensurate with the fault. And wouldn't I then become too hard on myself? Wouldn't I do to myself what God doesn't even do to me. I had that worry. But I thought, unless I try it, just kind of throw myself into it, I won't really know. And I tell you, it was such a blast.
Mm.
It opened up such a portal for magic and such a different way of relating. And it was largely the construct because we were all doing it. It wouldn't make sense if not everybody was into it.
Yeah, yeah. Poor old Kimberly over in the corner. We're just gonna beat her up for spilling the milk every day, right? Yeah.
But we were all doing it. Before each night meal, 3 of the nuns could kneel before we ate to acknowledge a fault. And it was hilarious because everyone would race to be the ones to get to do it. So, like, you'd have 10 nuns leaving our time of meditation to see who could get to the refectory first to kneel, to be in the top 3 who got to acknowledge their fault.
Amazing.
And think about if we did that without the ramification of I'm a bad person.
Yeah.
But we softened and made it easier to be able to just say we're sorry or just acknowledge a failing. Because even you work with a lot of people in transformation, and I do too, and there is even a big challenge for us Western folks to get so serious about our wounds and working through the wounds and acknowledging them and not getting wrapped up with defenses, or we get so serious that I think we make the process much harder. So I think John would have come from a culture that did way more of the practices than I did in monastic life, and it would have been more of a cultural thing. It would have had a clear severity with a glint in the eye, like with a little sparkle in the eye.
That's well said. And as I'm listening to you, what occurs to me too in a practice like that is that if somebody doesn't have a deeper faculty available to them, if somebody doesn't have something that's not of their personality, that's not of their human shortcomings, then it can be quite difficult to interpret these phrases, the wretchedness or the practices you were doing in a certain sense. But when somebody has a deeper sense that there's something about me that I can identify with in a deeper way that's not of this wretchedness or this confusion in a certain sense, then it's much easier for us to admit our shortcomings, because we're essentially saying we're admitting them, and the part of us that's admitting them knows that there's something greater than them. And I think for myself too, I've been able to say, since I've experienced more openings over the years, the more I have, the more I've been able to admit to others how much of a failure I feel in lots of areas, but in a way that I'm not glued to it, in a way that through acknowledging it, it actually frees me even more to be the fullness of myself, both my human messiness and the depth of myself that's not messy,
Yeah, I love that. And we don't have a culture that's nice around failing.
Mm.
And oftentimes we find, I think, I know I have felt this way, that the process of coming to that inner freedom is really just between me and God. That as much as I'd like to hope that we as human beings would be gracious to each other in being able to be more transparent with our failings, unfortunately, I don't find that we can expect unconditional love.
Absolutely. It's very
And
rare that we meet a human being that's able to offer us even close to that, right?
yeah, and that's lonely. That's a lonely path. John experienced it for sure. And I think that's where he gives us a friendship. That's why I really encourage people to become friends with these mystics,
Mm.
because he offers a friendship. He came to the point where he was capable of offering unconditional love. And he reveals that unfortunately it's a solitary journey. In the spiritual canticle, he says so eloquently, deep in the wine vault, I drank. And when I came out onto these fields, I no longer had a flock, and my one ministry is love.
Mm.
And that always speaks to me about being deep in the wine vault, deep in the inner place where we encounter the beloved alone. And it's only from that place we can really come forward and share it in a substantial way, share it in a way that our very presence can be transformative, whether we have a method or not.
I know that in St. John's, maybe in his 20s, he met St. Teresa of Avila, and she had a profound effect on him. And I'm curious, to what extent do you feel he filled that space for her, offering him that sense of human love? Because at the same time, as much as I agree with you that the depth of that meeting can only happen from that depth of emptiness or that depth of God, in a certain sense, I've noticed in my own life that there's certain aspects of me that, until they were met and continue to be by somebody who's clearer or more loving than I am in those places, it has filled a part of me that's lit my humanity more up in a way that I spent so long practicing in ways by myself and connecting and having wonderful experiences, but to be touched by another human being and to be seen there has really changed me in so many ways too. And I wonder, in your experience, what do you think that was like for John and his relationship with St. Teresa?
Oh, that's such a great reflection. I'm with you. I think that's why the guru paradigm still exists. Is there's
Absolutely.
that hunger to encounter something of the unknown in form. And I think it's pretty clear that people will have transformative experiences with a guru, only to find the guru is pretty human. And so the experience itself, though, was of the divine. So I'm with you that I think that we're meant to have a creative, an interface, that there's this paradoxical nature, and we're in a dance. We're in a dance. Uh, I I know they had a profound effect. I You have me curious about the nature of it. I know there was the soul meeting, that they both found a recognition that what they were experiencing of God was on the same vibrational frequency.
Yeah.
And they did meet that. Up until she met John, and John's 20 some years younger than her, up until she met John, she was not willing to start a male branch of her reform because she knew that none of the men, as good as they were, as full of integrity, as well intentioned, none of them had it. And she doesn't even describe what she was looking for, but none of them had it. And I was in the speak room this summer where they met. And it was as they walked into each other's presence that she said, I have met the person that could found the male branch. And in those days, as much as they had correspondence with each other, there was also a lot of independence because communication was slower. So the actual putting that in motion is interesting because it wasn't like she was managing him. Like today we've got Zoom, we've got business meetings, we've got phones, we've got ways to kind of collaborate in how we make a foundation or make a new project. And they wouldn't have had that same ability back in the day, and especially because of their gender difference. So he had to have moved her to such a degree that she had 100% encouragement. Now, on a personal level, you've got me curious about that
Mm.
because she's such a force to be reckoned with. I don't know how much he influenced her on a really personal level, personality-wise, other than the the way they would have gotten each other, because of they were both experiencing the same extraordinary phenomena of levitation and miracles and visions, and that they would have gotten each other on that level.
Even the recognition of that would have been profound for somebody. I mean,
Oh my word, right. I
can
think
you
back
can you
then.
imagine even back then? Because like at least these days, I mean, I've been blessed from a younger age to always have access to almost every teaching online since I was, 18 or 19. So I had no shortage of inspirational people, or people, at least even if I wasn't meeting them all in person, that I could come and drink from their well in a certain sense. But can you imagine what it must have been like for somebody young like that to actually meet somebody else in the flesh who was experiencing something similar, because they didn't have access to many books or experiences back then. It
Right,
must be
no,
incredible, yeah.
especially with the Inquisition. A lot of the people were taken away. It had to have been profound in that way. It had to have been a consolation to her, and his willingness to stay within the order probably was a personal affirmation too. Along that lines too, they both had the gift of being very intelligent.
Mm,
She was a brilliant businesswoman, and he was a brilliant leader. That's not really known that much about him, but his ability to, uh, when you meet a good leader who is capable of understanding what needs to be done, or understanding the people they're working with, or knows how to organize a movement, bring balance. He was very good at that. Uh, she was really, really, really good at business. And so they would have met each other there too. So they not only would have been having these mystical experiences, which oftentimes when somebody is, if that's their world, they're not always very grounded people. You know?
mm.
They're like, you know?
Away with the fairies, as we'd say in Ireland,
Yes.
right?
When they join the monastery, they're the ones washing all the dishes all the time, because that's the last thing they want to do is communicate
Yeah.
with some other part of monastic order, you know. I remember when I was having lots of experiences when I first joined the monastery, and I wasn't sharing a lot with a couple times it was outwardly evident because it was so dramatic, but otherwise I was able to keep it because we lived in silence. And I remember
Mm,
sitting there at one of the times we spoke at what's called a table recreation on a feast day. That's where you eat and talk at the same time, which we rarely did. And I remember, I can't remember, oh, it was the Feast of Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, was a Carmelite who would fly into these ecstasies as she was cooking. So they'd find her for hours holding a skillet with an egg in it, and she's lost in ecstasy.
That's amazing.
And at another time, she was so filled with love, and she knew her sisters weren't open to this unconditional love, and she ran through the halls, breaking silence, banging a bell, saying, "We've got to wake up! We've got to wake up to love! Wake up to love!"
Oh, wow.
And the leader in my community, who I thought, because I didn't know her well, who I thought would exalt this. Here we've got this learning that this is what we're here for. And look at these other Carmelites. She said, well, some saints are to be imitated and some are to be admired.
Mm.
And her point was, don't any of you know,
Yeah.
don't get into that behavior.
Yeah. The wildness, that's something that's rarely in many traditions sort of resolved. I think many of the Indian saints and people like Hafez and the Sufi people, they're celebrated in that way, to have the stillness, the depth of that, and the absolute raging wildness at the same time. I think in the Christian traditions, that's often a little more suppressed, probably in the same way that sexuality is, because it's that same wild base force that just wants to take us over. And I think it's lovely hearing those stories, but also disappointing that they weren't encouraged in the order you were in, right?
In the monastery itself.
Yeah.
Uh, I love that you're using the word wild. Yeah, wild is just such a great descriptor, and such a great one of John. Uh, he was so incredibly wild. Even in the Living Flame of Love that I sent you, which I just love that poem. He's like, break the membrane that separates us. Do it again. He's like, do it again. Break the membrane.
Beautiful.
That's wild. And that's so audacious when it comes to God. I think a way he inspires me, which I always long for him to inspire others, is that wildness, that audacity to not just be a little outlandish here in this world, but when it comes to the actual relationship with the divine doesn't want us going, yes, yes. There's an element of that that's a metaphor of being contained and harnessed. I like that
Yes.
reason. But that's so that we'll be these raging mystics, really juicy. And John was so that way.
Mm, beautiful.
Yeah.
I think one of the things he's probably best known for, Kimberly, if people know him in a kind of a peripheral way, is his work around the dark night of the soul. And maybe we could delve into that a little bit. And you had said some interesting things to me on the phone about it last week. But just even starting with the three phases of what they are in his description and how they apply to us in the modern life.
Oh, the purgatory part, the illumination, those three phases.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, in his ascent of Mount Carmel, he talks about as we grow in wholeness, usually it starts with the obvious material ways, and he would call that dark night of the senses. When our senses fall short to lead us to the wellspring within.
Mm, mm,
And he speaks that we're very often delusional in how we use our senses. And we very quickly not only project in modern terminology, but we truly don't see, feel, taste, and touch and hear things as they truly are. So he says to come into that wholeness, we need to be willing to step into the darkness of recognizing the fact that what we see is probably not reality. When I
mm.
look through these eyes, I'm probably not seeing reality.
My sense of it as well is like when people on a spiritual path, or when people in any form of their path, they form into a sense of delusionment about their lives. They just become disillusioned about where things are going, that they have a deep sense that whatever their senses is offering them is not going to fulfill them in the way they think. And they fall into a sense of darkness with that can seem very separating from probably those around him. But if they have a pathway with that, it can start to lead to some of these deeper phases that we're going to probably speak about, right?
Yeah, and I think friendship with John can help someone keep very close to the deeper movement of God at their center that is leading into the, oh, it's not that, oh, it's not that, that can be scary when the identity gets destroyed.
Mm,
It's not that the self is going to be lost, but that it will be found. And we're blessed to have writings such as John that speaks so eloquently to it, so that there doesn't have to be the felt aloneness. But I have always found in my own life what Teresa says is that when light arises from within, it always happens with a gentle constellation. And even amidst the destruction, if we can come into that place of true stillness amidst the destruction, we will taste the life force that is the impelling factor causing the destruction. That is quite possible. It's quite possible. It doesn't make it maybe less scary, but it lets the scariness not be the dominant force.
I remember when I came across his work, I was probably 24 or 25, and I found a lot of solace in it. And one of the things he spoke about, and other writers who were referencing him spoke about, was that for most people who come into this dark night or this deeper space of disillusionment, they've usually experienced some illumination. It's like their soul is ready to excavate some of this deeper darkness inside of them. So they've experienced something deeper, and it allows the depths of the psyche to start to come into consciousness. And in, like you said, it can be quite destructive. It certainly was for me. And it can be very disillusioning because you have a sense, wait a second, I've discovered something beautiful, and now suddenly I'm swamped with darkness. What's going on here?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And in his poem, he's come to a place, and as when we were talking on the phone, I'll just say it here so people can remember this. The poem, The Dark Night of the Soul, is considered his poem of enlightenment, of illumination. It's not his poem of being in dark night,
Yeah, that's very important, isn't it?
of being enlightened. This is the celebration of being enlightened. And in the chapel where he died, where they did this beautiful 4-panel painting, each panel was a different painting expressing a poem. And of course, Dark Night was there. And that was celebrated out of all his poetry of his coming into being God. Because he says at the end of his life, the soul's center is God. And he isn't expressing any contradiction in that. The soul center is God. He came to that truth that certainly, obviously, if he had lived longer, he probably would have been killed in the Spanish Inquisition. He certainly came close a few times. But he's celebrating. He uses the word happy. In almost every stanza of the poem, he uses the word happy and lucky. Happy, lucky flight. In darkness I escaped. And he was capable of doing it because his house, his whole being, was calm and safe. And then in our beginning, which I love that phrase, he talks about the flaming of his very heart was his one guide.
Maybe you could read some of it. Would you read a little bit?
I would love that. On that happy night, in secret, no one saw me through the dark, and I saw nothing then. No other light to mark the way, but fire pounding my heart. That flaming guided me more firmly than the noonday sun, and waiting there was God, I knew so well, who shone where nobody appeared to come. O night, my guide, O night more friendly than the dawn, O tender night that tied lover and the loved one.
So much in there to unravel or explore. And I just want to reiterate that I think when I discovered his work, I had a teacher when I was about 25 or 6 that pointed me to a very long article, and most of it was about St. John. And it really gave me hope, Kimberly. It really gave me a pathway to see that I wasn't being punished with all of the suffering that was coming up after this magnificent opening I'd had. I probably spent about a year like lying on the couch in this very empty, sort of painful, empty kind of space that I felt had deep potential, but I also felt the depth of its pain. And it was like, when I came across St. John and other people that were writing about him, it just gave me hope and a pathway through, in a way that, even though I wasn't actively reading St. John very much at all, it provided me with a map and a safe passage that I knew. And so many of his writings here, maybe I'll quote a couple here, about turning towards suffering. When suffering is arising, actually turning towards it. And here's a couple of quotes from that. He says, "Love consists not in feeling great things, but in having great detachment and in suffering for the beloved."
Yeah. Right. And he would be able to say that from a place of a lot of challenge,
Exactly.
He only he only he only points lightly to inner challenges. I think we get the fact, if you read a sentimental poem, we get the fact that he turned directly towards his inner challenges, but he doesn't speak like where Teresa talks about all her turmoil in her head. He doesn't speak so much about that. But we do have the fact that many, many times in his life, there was challenge. He was so relational. He loved his sisters. He figured women had a lot more to teach than men when it came to union with God. And he'd hang out with women as much as he could. And during a few times, not only when he was kidnapped and imprisoned, but even after that, he was more than once exiled to monasteries that were really out in the middle of nowhere, and his contact was diminished. And as much as he gives testimony to the path of solitude and silence, he was very relational. He felt like he had been swallowed by the whale. He quotes Jonah, the book of Jonah, being swallowed by the whale and missing everybody so much. And he 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 was so human. All of these lights he gives us is because he was so human, and he really suffered from desiring to be with the people he loved, and desiring that there would be peace in his order, and all of these tremendously human. But what it teaches him is exactly what you're sharing. I gained great solace. There was one person on my retreat who grew up in a home life that had been very abusive,
Mm.
and she didn't realize he revealed himself to her. And even though he didn't have an abusive home, he had a lot of abusiveness that happened in his life.
Certainly.
And she found that his inspiration wasn't coming because he was untouched by life. It was coming because he let himself be touched
Mm.
by life.
Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another quote here that it really reminded me of the Tibetan practice of Tonglen.
Yes, yes, that's great.
Yeah, which is really a higher practice in Tibetan teachings, in the sense that if somebody doesn't have some grounding in that open space, it's usually not recommended to do it. But here's what he says first, and maybe we can speak about it. He says, "Beloved, all that is harsh and difficult I want for myself, and all that is gentle and sweet for thee." So he's really turning the logic of the ego on its head there, where normally we want to draw close to us what's sweet and beautiful and push away at all costs what's difficult. And in a certain way, my sense is with Tong Len and also with this quote is, it's not so much that we're wanting to live a difficult life so much as we're wanting to, by turning the logic of ego on its head there, we're bringing it into balance.
Yes, I love your language around that. Thank you. I do. I love your language around that. I don't use ego language so much in my own teaching, but I really appreciate the way you're using, uh, ego here. It dismantles the way the ego can get ego driven about our spirituality. So, right, turning right into the face of it, right into the face. I agree. What's a time in your own life that you did that you went right into the heart uh, of a suffering?
Well, I think I've done a lot of that. I think in a certain sense, around that time when I was younger, I actually, probably in hindsight, I used to delve into it too much, where I would constantly go at it. We were doing dyads, friends of mine together for many hours a day, and delving into our pain and speaking about everything. Done, hundreds or thousands of hours of psychotherapy like that. And what I've noticed over the years is, if it's not balanced with that deeper holding, that deeper space that obviously was so available to St. John and so many of these people, then we need to find that balance where we're moving towards difficulty. But the reason I think these quotes are so useful is that It's actually the opposite in society is what everybody's doing. We're constantly trying to push away what's difficult and hold together on the small little island of what we have, of what's safe and beneficial. And what I think someone like St. John, he offers such inspiration to people whose life is already challenging. It's not that we're going out of our way to bring more difficulties towards us, but if they're here, they're here. And they offer us a sense to become intimate with that. And it's not a mistake that our suffering is arising. It's actually, it can be a passageway through, no matter what it is. And I think for all of us, the reality is there's far more suffering inside of us than any of us would care to admit in our psyche. And if it's arising to be met. And when it starts to come to us like that, the pathway he's offering there is to turn head towards it and feel it fully in the body and turn it into something sacred rather than something we're constantly trying to banish, which actually just keeps knocking on our door eternally until we have the courage to turn and face it, you know?
Right. And he always seems to do it from so much presence.
Mm.
It's the presence he brings in the journey. And I think that speaks to the balance that you're referring to, that we shift quickly when we offer ourselves on the deep unconscious level, when we offer ourselves what we're really longing for, which is to be seen, to be held, to be heard, to be free in that. And he models it superbly, just superbly, and turning directly into, when he was in prison for the 7 months, it was there that he wrote most of the spiritual canticle. Talk about turning into your suffering. Imagine how that would have felt. So here he's imprisoned for something he didn't even want to start. You know, Teresa of Avila was the one that wanted to start the male branch of the order.
Take her instead. Yeah.
You know, it's like he didn't even want to start it. And then when they wanted to silence her and they made her prioress back at the Incarnation, because the Incarnation was of the old observance, he brought him in as confessor. And because of his degree of enlightenment and freedom, everyone was going through radical transformation. It wasn't really through so much her. She knew that if anybody had him as a spiritual director, they would change, because he was able to bring that quality of presence into the very suffering parts of the person.
Beautiful.
And so the whole monastery is converted, and everyone's like on fire for the love of God, letting go of their class system and letting go of all this. And it's from there he gets kidnapped. So here he is, just simply being of service in the most anonymous sense. He's not like an activist that's writing articles. He's not, you know, Teresa was beautiful in her charismatic way of her way of approaching conflict was to speak, was to get out there and write a letter. She wrote letters to the king. She wrote letters to the popes. She wrote letters to the, you know, and that wasn't his way. And yet he's the one that's imprisoned, but he saw the imprisonment as a metaphor for where God was wanting to take him. So as whole and beautiful a soul as he was becoming, I think the soul is already pristine, the self, as he's becoming, he knew he wasn't kind of there yet, that he wasn't totally free yet. And he let that. That's staying in a small room. I saw where it was a small room that he was short and he couldn't even fully stand up in it.
Wow.
Had even no bathroom, no change of clothes, a small window to let in a little light. And every Friday he was taken into the common room and flagellated by his brothers who wanted to help him come into the light.
Flagellated mean beaten, right?
Yeah, so flagellation was an accepted form of penance.
Yeah.
That's exists even today, and it's a braided rope that usually has one strand that then separates into 3 strands, so that when you use it, the 3 strands kind of, and you hit yourself with it. as a way of being united to Jesus in the scourging. So here all his brothers are doing it to help him come into the truth. So he spends 7 months in that state, and from it we have the spiritual canticle. And there is a point when he breaks through. Now, and I encourage people to let that be a metaphor, because most people don't go through that extreme situation today, but we do in the way we imprison ourselves. You talked about causing ourselves suffering. How many times have we totally flagellated ourselves until we're whimpering on the floor? I mean, we terrible. He never reveals what happened before he escaped. Something in him shifted. Something in him came into freedom. Something. He never speaks about it. But after that, he has the vision of Mary, who says to him, let's get out of here. And it's almost like she's saying, you could have, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, like, you could have come home all along, but you just didn't know. You didn't get it. And within a day, he escapes. What a great metaphor that when we wake up, we escape. When we wake up, we...
Yeah, it's beautiful. And talk about an inspiration for somebody using their life circumstances for the good, to purify themselves. And one of the other things I was thinking about there, we were saying earlier around the taboo in society around admitting our shortcomings, or how much actually all of us feel like a failure at the bottom, that we've never been able to control life in the way we wished. We've never been able to organize things, and maybe we can in some area of our lives in the short term, but ultimately, whether it's our looks, whether it's money, whatever it is, all these things start to fade in certain ways, and we start to recognize our failures. And I think the way he speaks about it, I'll read a quote here about this, of how we're not supposed to succeed in certain ways here. There's something else for us. He says, especially with spiritual experiences, he's referring to here specifically. He says, hence, they would be very foolish who would think that God is failing them because of their lack of spiritual sweetness and delight, or rejoice thinking they possess God because of the presence of this sweetness. And they would be more foolish if they were to go in search of this sweetness in God and rejoice and be detained in it. Interesting how he says detained in it. With such an attitude, they would no longer be seeking God with their wills grounded in emptiness of faith and charity, but they would be seeking spiritual satisfaction and sweetness, which are creatures, by following after their own pleasure and appetite. And thus they would no longer be loving God purely above all things, which means centering all of the strength of one's will on him.
Oh, amen. As you're reading it, I have to admit, I want to just take his cheeks, and I love you.
That's gorgeous. Yeah. Isn't that such a thing in society, though, especially in maybe people who are just getting into spirituality? Because you do, when you sit and you're peaceful for a while, especially starting out, you have a certain sense, many people do, have a honeymoon period where you sit down and you're just able to rest in openness, and you feel your heart light up and you feel everything. And there's a certain sense in which delighting in that is natural. But what he's pointing at here is so much deeper. Is like, if you really want to be intimate with God, you accept the face of God in whatever way it's happening, and you don't seek out sweetness and delight.
Right. Oh, amen. You just put that so well. I don't even think I want to add to it. John's words and your words, there is such certainty there. There's such certainty. And I love so much the way he's capable of speaking about the relationship. It's a relational quality with our experiences, with ourselves, with God. And he never diminishes the power and the relevance of the fact that we're relational creatures by nature. And he describes for me what is the true nature of relationship. the true nature of it, so that we can come into that wholeness, into that utter freedom. I remember in my honeymoon period,
Mm.
I was in Santa Cruz working with the homeless, and doing some school and that. And I was also doing home health care because I love the older generations. I love that stage of life when people are coming to the end of their, their physical lifetime. And I was working with this man who was really lovely, but also a bit tough.
Mm.
And I had to do things like, cleaning his dentures and helping him shower. And he was supposed to not be smoking, but he was always somehow getting cigarettes, and I had to be the sheriff when I found them in his walk. and and I remember one day he was sitting there at table, and I was bringing him his food. And as I brought his food to him and I set it down, everything shape shifted, and he was Christ. And on both sides, I was on one side of him, and this other Carmelite, Elizabeth of the Trinity, was on the other side, and the three of us were walking down the road. Everything in that little humble house just changed into that vision. And I think that was a penetration into the reality of creation. And as we become more and more sustained in that level of freedom, we can expect that kind of seeing things and being in relationship with things as they truly are, not as a disassociation from the physical reality
Mm.
of things, but the physical reality almost giving way to itself as a vehicle of consciousness and form.
That's a lovely way of saying it. That's a lovely way of saying it. Giving way. I like that. Something else, one of my favorite quotes that I have here in front of me when I read it a few days ago, was really blown away by this one, about how all of us, in a certain sense, our mind, a part of it, is really designed to want certainty. And what he's speaking about here is, he says, if a man wishes to be sure of the road he treads on, he must close his eyes and walk in the dark.
Yes, that's a perfect reminder. And I find it's so wonderful because I think it can be so difficult to find statements that have a certain black and white quality to them because we're in the unknown. But it does seem that statement holds its truth. It's still true today. And it's something that I find we all can lean into as a real simple reorienting of our focus. It can be the reminder of, oh, where is my will focused? And we just simply turn. We just simply turn. Just like if you were working with somebody who was 3 years old and you were teaching them how to write with a crayon, or how to put the crayons back in the box, or that, it would be a gentle reminder, right? Oh, no, we put the green crayon back in here. And then the 3-year-old forgets, and you go, oh, we put the green crayon back in here. And then
Mm.
the 3-year-old forgets, and then, no, we put the green crayon in here. Let's pick it up together. What if we had that kind of sweet gentleness in remembering these phrases as just simply the redirection of where we're putting our energy right in that moment?
Yeah, the difficulty for the mind, and I think the aspect of that's challenging, is that if we really start to come to terms with the depth of how much we don't know, the reality is there is some suffering to be felt in that. There is some unpleasantness in the body, and there's no way around that. And like he's saying, rather than turning away from that, let's go head first towards that, because that's there, and that's just going to wait inside of all of us until we have the strength or stability to turn and be with that, right?
Oh, so true. Yeah, so true. And thank you for always, that's a great reality check. And there's such liberation in your words. I really love the way you put that.
It's like nobody's actually stupid. That's what I've been thinking over the last maybe 10 years or so when I think of people who don't get involved in the spiritual path or don't start to go to therapy or start to really examine themselves. At some level they know that there's going to be a lot of challenge and turmoil in it. And the other angle that often occurs to me with that is that if people actually knew there was a pathway through some of these places, my sense is far more people would take up a path like this that actually really investigate it. It's the feeling that any time they've come close to that suffering, they haven't had a tool or a companion or a friend or a teacher around them that's offered them a true passage through it, you know? But people aren't really lazy. They just have a sense of hopelessness because any time they've ever tried to face these places, it's ended in, you know, re-traumatization, essentially, where they've brought something up and they haven't been able to find a way through, you know?
Right. And I have, similar to you, I have a belief that the soul is always seeking union.
Mm.
And that obviously, could I be wrong on that? Like that's just coming from my own experience. Uh, and so yours is coming from your experience.
Yeah.
And it definitely is an experience that becomes something of a creed. You know, it leads you to want to serve that urging for the highest good for each human. It leads me to want to share with others the freedom that has come from my own experience. So it's a leading force, and yet even in that we are in the dark with it too. Uh, but I do believe that that's there. It's a mystery, believing that that soul is longing for that and witnessing the hopelessness, even in the face of the myriad of people and tools that are out there today. The shining example we have of godlikeness that's there, whether it simply be somebody that was suicidal and came through the other side and now has a tool set that helps, whether it's somebody that embodies the presence and packs your groceries in such a way that you can feel it. You know, there there's so much at our disposal to offer us encouragement that there is light to become, that we're being called to be light through the suffering. And it is a mystery that the soul would long for that, and yet as a human species we we choose to stay in concealment more than thrust ourselves wildly into the dark path, into awareness. That is a mystery. I find refuge, honestly, actually not in the Christian tradition around that, though
Mm.
it's my Christian tradition that leads me to it. I find refuge in the philosophical writings of non-dual Shaiva Tantra.
Mm. Mm.
I think that it speaks eloquently to the process of concealment and awareness and the mystery that both of those are the acts of God. But the concealment itself is part of the act of God in play coming into form. I know that just went very, very philosophical from where
No,
you
that's
were.
okay. That's good.
Very,
Yeah.
uh, and and I think that's where when you have people like John and others who walked the path and became the goal, as far as we
Mm.
know,
Mm.
that there is this tone of penetrating understanding into human nature that results into the idealism that you and I both have, and the understanding of the deviousness of the human being in its avoidance game.
Something about some kind of tipping point there of like the sort of gathering of the confidence of the soul to be able to face its own darkness. And I think someone like him offers so much of that inspiration to someone like me and probably many others. And one of the other things I have here in front of me as a quote is really alluding to, we actually don't know what's going on inside of the depths of ourselves when we start to engage in spiritual practice and transformation. It might seem on the surface of things that we've really brought up more stuff and it's worse than ever. And I love what he's saying here about this, because I think it can really offer solace to people that keep going, essentially. He says, God has to work in the soul in secret and in darkness, because if we fully knew what was happening and what mystery, transformation, God and grace will eventually ask of us, we would either try to change or to stop the whole process.
Right. Mm-hmm.
What it really brings to me there is just, we actually don't know if it's bad that even if we're experiencing more suffering on the surface of things, maybe something else in a much deeper way that's outside of our conscious mind is transforming and changing. I love how he's speaking to that there.
Right. And I find the ultimate consolation is that we don't really get there. We surrender in our inability to get there.
Beautiful. That's such an
The
important point.
quality of that surrender lets us have the direct experience that all along God has been moving us, and we can not only rest in the grace of receiving grace, but we can rest in the fact that it is an unceasing wellspring rising up within us. And the discovery of that can only happen when we give up, when we so experience our limitations that we totally give up as a response to these inner urgings.
Well, that's a gorgeous segue to delve into a little bit about some of the writings he has around will, because and again, I have a few quotes here in front of me. Just to be clear before I say them, I think these are relevant to a certain aspect of the path. I don't think there's anything wrong, or I think it's actually absolutely necessary to use our will in certain ways to bring ourselves to certain parts of ourselves. But what he's speaking about here, I think it's a very high teaching. He says things like, however high be your endeavors, unless you renounce and subjugate your own will, unless you forget yourself and all that pertains to yourself, not one step will you advance on the path to perfection.
Not one step. Isn't that lovely how clear that is? Not one step. Coming from that place with our will, not one step will we get closer. And if it's a step, it makes me think, if it's a step, then there is step. There's either movement towards or movement away. A step connotes that, right? It's movement. I think, wasn't it Einstein who said, we're either moving forward or we're moving backwards. There is no standing still. Not one step.
That seems paradoxical to me in a sense. I spent a lot of time when I was younger around the teachings of Gurdjieff, and he would talk about a lot around the use of will, and he would speak around the fragmented self, or he would call it multiple eyes, and the use of the will to gather those fragmented parts of ourselves into one coherent man, he would say. And my sense is that's such a valuable use of our will, to gather ourselves and then to bring ourselves to the edge. And my sense is a quote like this is where he's really speaking to. When we can gather ourselves and bring ourselves to the edge, not one step from there will help. We have to align ourselves with something deeper, with something higher, something more simple.
Yeah, and he and Teresa and all the Carmelites, one of the things I love about that tradition is there is a stress that the faculties given to us are of God. So whereas a mainstream idea of Christianity, because we have much woundedness around that, mainstream relation is that there is a denial of the goodness of actually being in material form. that everything needs to be held suspiciously. If you look at the mystics of the Christian tradition and the mystical theologians, you'll find that the actual opposite is true. But the Carmelites in particular, in fact, Teresa, I'm sure John taught the same, but Teresa is very, very strong on not suspending the use of the mind or the will
Well said.
or the emotion in the process, and but rather to accept the limited nature of how we use these faculties, so that the faculties themselves are of God. You know, when I was, I'm thinking I was 7. It was somewhere around there, and I grew up there in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was laying there on the grass one summer, looking up at the sky like kids used to do.
Now we just look at it on YouTube, right? Yeah.
Yeah, at the sky on YouTube. That's great. That's great. And I was laying there, and I started thinking about my will, and I got really scared of my will. I got totally scared because I'm a passionate person. I'm very enthusiastic. I have a lot of oomph in what I do in general, and a certain level of intensity. And I was terrified because I had this thought. I'm like, oh my God. And literally I was talking to God. I'm like, oh my God, what if I do terrible things? What if I use my will and I just do terrible things all my life? I was terrified at the power that I was experiencing of having this will, and the fire I felt around this movement, because I liked will. I liked doing stuff. I liked creating things. And so it made me really happy. This will part of me I liked a lot. And in the moment that I had that thought and I turned to God in that angst, it was like veils pulled back and this very clear insight came. And it was an insight without words. But the takeaway in the words is, your will is so beautiful, and all you need to do is harness it and direct it towards God.
Mm.
And that's where I think the practice and the work comes in to develop the skillfulness to harness and let be harnessed. Therese of Lisieux was terrified of her will when she wanted nothing to do with her will. And she said, I give you my will 100%, God, because I want your will. Talk about audacious. I want your will. So she didn't say my will is bad. She said, I'm terrified of my individual will, and I want your will in everything I do. That's pretty awesome, isn't it?
Fascinating, yeah. For me, Kimberly, when I was younger, I was about 2021. I think that was the main gateway into deeper spirituality for me, was probably in a more secular way. I came across some of these teachings questioning free will, started looking back in philosophers like Spinoza. I was so mesmerized by it that I actually started a website called, which is no longer available, thegreatesttrick.com, where I had people answer a kind of a questionnaire showing them, or really questioning how much of their will was actually free. And that's what I hear from you too, of your perspective when you were 7, actually starting to inquire into what is my will, what is this thing. And it's been a fascinating journey for me over the years. I think, like Teresa there, like you said, part of me was wanting to abandon my own personal will a lot sooner than I was actually ready to. And I'm still in relationship with that in lots of different ways, because I saw that something much deeper was actually running things. And it's only been over the years that I've kind of come into more harmony with that inquiry, in a sense that there's parts of me that feel like I can personally do, but it's become much, much looser, in a sense, where the feeling of being done and the feeling of doing have become quite seamless a lot of the time. But I wouldn't say that I'm not a doer, nor would I say that I'm always being done. It's a very sort of seamless dance that and obviously when there's periods of suffering, which there definitely are for me, it's not as seamless. I feel like I'm confronted by decisions and certain things, but I think it's a fascinating inquiry for anybody to enter into, and rather than ever taking a certain perspective of I have free will or I don't, just entering honestly into that inquiry. And there's some very interesting practices I do with people I work with too, of really looking at that. They can really open a much deeper relationship with themselves and something higher than ourselves as well, you know.
Mm, yes. And I love this. You're referring again to relationship. I love the way doing and being done is such a paradoxical statement. And I think one of the major contributions for me that John brings, not to me because I think my spirituality is so much like his in general, just the way we operate a bit, the lover aspect of things. So I don't say that I get this from him, but
Yeah.
what I love being a spokesperson for, and I'm so glad he's still so relevant, is that we're in a world of so much confusion because the notions of God that are put out there and have been put out there have will always fall short, but have fallen greatly short. So much that many people reject the notion of even using the word God. And he gives testimony. I think Hafiz and Rumi and them, they all give testimony as well, but that this relational quality, and even if we term it as self and self, big S, small s, that there's something in that dance, the doing and the being done. And I I don't think there's a human being, if you teased it out, that couldn't come to some really powerful, transformative stories in their own life where consciously or subtly consciously didn't have the distinction of doing and being done happen at some moment, at some pivotal moment or a moment of crisis or
It's a really
a
good
moment.
point. Yeah.
And John really gives a power punch to the reality of that relational dance that we're in with this doing and being done and God and God's self and that I love that he's relevant. I love that
Hmm.
when people move away from the relational quality of nature, sometimes I find they're disassociating. They're using their will to try to get to a truth, but the truth has become so abstract that they're not actually in their bodies
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. I wanted to share a couple of deeper quotes here from him because one of the things that really has inspired me in looking at some of his works and others speaking about him is the depth at which he was willing to face his own inner destruction. He was willing to face aspects of himself that weren't true, and he was willing to suffer the consequences of facing the pain of those places in a very unusual way that I've come across probably in only a few of the Christian mystics to this kind of depth, and more so in some of the Eastern teachers. They're more talking about the death of self or the absolute puncturing of self in certain ways. And I just love when I find teachings in Christianity that resonate with that same sentiment. And one of them is here. He's kind of going through this. I'll read a little bit. He's going through the three phases again of the Dark Night, I think, in some of the writing here. But he says, hence for the soul to be in its center, which is God, it is sufficient for it to possess one degree of love, for by one degree alone it is united with him through grace. So he's speaking of entering into a deeper relationship with God. And then he's going deeper. He says, should it have 2 degrees, it becomes united and concentrated in God in another, deeper center. And here he's talking about the deepest one for him. He says, but once it has attained the final degree, God's love has arrived at wounding the soul in its ultimate and deepest center, which is to illuminate and transform it in its whole being, power and strength, and according to its capacity, until it appears to be God.
I love that. I love that. He shines such a great light on what it means to be fully alive. And there's just so much there in what he shares. And you're right. He gives a great voice to the wounding that is part of the path, that it actually can't happen without the wounding. And it makes sense. Like if I think of it even just on a science level, if 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 a cell has a membrane and becomes what we call a cell that's got identified parts, and yet its wholeness comes from no longer being a cell, but from breaking, being having its membrane broken open so that its reality can reveal. That's just utter destruction of the sense of self and identity. And he speaks about the wounding quality. He and Teresa both, speak about dying because they don't die.
Mm.
And part of that, I think, is truly that when we're in ecstasy, whether you've experienced it or not, when we are in that, you do want to die. I mean, you it's so delicious. You feel like you're dying, and you do want to die, and there's kind of this almost this agony. It's almost like the feelings before like an orgasm or something.
Mm.
Like you almost want to die, and and yet you feel like you're dying. And so but he speaks so eloquently to that woundingness that happens, and that it happens over and over again.
I think what's so powerful about what he's saying there for me is, I think in many writings, Christian and others, they'll talk about the wounding of the psyche in order to let God's love penetrate, or let that deeper nature penetrate. But with the way I'm reading what he's saying here is, in this third or deeper way, there even needs to be a wounding of the soul, where even the soul is delusional in a sense, that it's holding together these false sense of self separate from God. And he's willing to even be broken in that space so this deeper unit of space can come through. I spent a lot of time when I was younger in the Eastern Advaita Vedanta teachings. I would say they were the most I spent time in. And I remember as I read this a few days ago, I was reminded of a phrase from Nisargadatta Maharaj, one of the more famous teachers in that lineage. And he would say, he would talk about that, the destruction or the openness of the psyche, but later on, even the sense of I amness, the sense of his beingness. One day he said to a student, he said, I have taken an axe to the I am, he said. And it reminded me of that same thing, that even there, he wasn't separate. He wasn't separate from the deeper mystery of things. He had so been willing to be cracked by something. And that's when I read that in St. John, I was just so happy to see it, that same writing in this third degree of opening, as he's describing, even his soul became wounded by God, that he couldn't even hold that together as separate.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I'm not sure how I think about that use of the word soul in the
Mm.
translation, but I completely 100% find that consolation with John too, is that the deepest sense of wholeness or self, or that is still a distinction. It's still an
Yeah.
identification. Um, I have not done any real theological investigation into use of the word soul, but I'm inclined to have a felt sense that when he says the soul is God, the soul is God, that he discovers the soul is God, and that is the self that's destroyed and discovered. Like the soul is this elemental breath that already is God, but he hasn't discovered that yet. And that the soul isn't quite broken because it's already God. And that may be just a dumb distinction, but
I
since
understand, yeah. It's just, in a certain sense, semantics or different way of looking at things, but really resonating with the same sentiment.
right, right, yeah, I really affirm the sentiment, and that it does exist in potency within the Christian mystical tradition, and clarity, and clarity. Christianity didn't ever develop because of its sacramental system. It was not as given to create processes like we have so eloquently in other traditions. in so many different forms of Buddhism, you've got these in-depth, sophisticated processes for which to
Yeah.
get to know yourself.
Yeah.
And Christianity has pockets that develop that a bit more, but not nearly with the systematics.
That's why it's beautiful to come across these things, because exactly, he's usually not offering a prescription so much as a description of his own discovery into that way of being. Whereas I think particularly the Tibetans, the Taoists, and probably some other those traditions have a very, very strong tradition of offering many different, meditational technologies that can offer people gateways into these places. And it's kind of amazing to see people like him and Meister Eckhart and others who have, it's so clear that they have penetrated those same mysteries in the depths of themselves.
Yeah. I would think one of the frameworks that they would, Eckhart and John and everybody would have, that I feel I have, having grown up Catholic, I think that was one of the greatest gifts, is that sacramental world perspective. So if all creation is a sacrament, if everything is a setup for grace, everything. So if that's the foundation of your experience, which is what Catholicism actually purports. I know that's lost in translation, but it's actually what its embodiment is that everything is a sacrament. If we actually really took that to heart, then everything we've been sharing, both about John and our experiences, finds a home in that. We find our direct pointer to where we're meant to look. If this moment of us sharing is a sacrament, then it's just between me and God. And this is just between you and God. And whoever listens, this is just between them and God. Everything is a sacramental moment. It is where there is potentially or actually the moment, and the setup itself is an instrument of the grace of union. So I think that's probably where we get the Christian mystics, is they would have had that.
Directly, yeah. Reminds me of the tantric teachings of India and Tibet too, when you speak about it, the word of tantra meaning to weave together. So they're taking the sacrament, the moments of what's happening, and they're using it to unify themselves with the deeper aspects of themselves. Yeah,
it's like it's a worldview that sets it up pretty solidly. It's like, well, if you're going to take that as true, then okay, that changes every single moment that's going to happen.
I wanted to finish this quote here too, because we're talking about the wounding of the soul, and it just goes on. I think it's a nice finishing of this, because obviously he's speaking in such negative language in a certain sense of being so broken by God. And here's how he finishes. He says, "When light shines on a clear and pure crystal, we find that the more intense the degree of light, the more light the crystal has concentrated within it, and the brighter it becomes. It can become so brilliant from the abundance of light received that it seems to be all light. And then the crystal is indistinguishable from the light, since it is illuminated according to its full capacity, which is to appear to be light."
Oh, yeah, that's so perfect. He's so perfect. How can you not love him?
It's just gorgeous, isn't it? And I think that's really a beautiful quote, the two pieces of that, because it really brings it into balance. His ability to face the destruction within leads to his own realization of how much light his open body, his open being can be penetrated by God, and how much he can live in that fullness of being.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. He speaks to my mind and heart and life experience to date. He speaks such a word of truth there. Such a word of truth. And the truth always contains the greatest consolation, doesn't it? The truth. I was on a Mystic Monday call with some of my people last night, and one of the lines that's so potent that came up is, "The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free."
And I think in this sense, the first half of that quote, I've heard people say things the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off tremendously. And it's the sense of having to face the agony of being out of alignment with truth first, and then actually in the end, exactly, it'll have its way with you.
Yeah. And on that line is the full of hope I climbed the day, where he says it so eloquently. You've got that quote on me. In this most exalted quest, the higher I began to soar, the lower I felt more sore and broken and depressed. I said, none can seize the prey, and groveled so low, that higher did I go, and at last I caught my prey.
Ah, that is. Can you send that to me afterwards? That is just
Sure.
gorgeous. That is just gorgeous. Oh man, that's it. I think you really captured what we were saying there. Yeah. You had mentioned before at the start there, Kimberly, to me, that you might do some chanting there before we finish. You do you do some of the chanting in the original way that he did it, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
So now this one is in the Liber Usualis, which is an 18th century translation by the monks of Salem.
Mm.
However, this was one of the Marian anthems that they would have chanted this way back in his day. So this anthem that I'm going to chant is a little slightly more ornate version of the Salve Regina. And we chanted this as he would have as well, because the monastery I joined preserved the ritual in close to how it started.
Mm.
So I had many hours, days, and years of getting to participate in the depth of ritual that John himself would have participated in.
Mm.
And this chant was only and always chanted on particular feast days. So it carried an energetic signature to it that is very exalted. And it would be the last chant we would chant before entering grand silence when we would go to sleep.
Mm.
And so until we broke silence again, this would be what would be resounding in the halls and would have come from our mouths. So just to give you a little bit of context so you understand
Thank you.
when we would have chanted
Yeah.
it. And the brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the founders of Carmel, are Mary and Elijah. And I think in that we have the divine masculine and the divine feminine, which makes Carmelite a particularly mystical order as well, because its founders didn't even exist in its direct foundation in the 1200s. So that is what John would have driven John to join the Carmelites. All right, the Solemn Salve. Salve Regina Mater misericordiae Vita Dulcedo Espes nostra Salve. A te clamamus, exulens, vivieve. A te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in ad lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculo ad nos converte. Et Jesum benedictum, Christum ventris tuus, nobis post exsidium ostende. O clement, o pia, o dulci Virgo Maria.
Beautiful.
Thank
Just
you.
before we finish up, I wonder what resources you would recommend for people if they want to delve more deeply into St. John. Is there any particular translations or books, or what would you recommend in that line?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I do really like who I mentioned. This book is Willis Barstone. Yeah, he has a lot of other readings as well, but I'll put this up so you can see it. Willis Barnstone.
Willis Burnstone. The Poems
Mhm.
of St. John of the Cross. Yeah.
Yes. You know what? Very honestly, because many of the teachers that I find that love John are so very Catholic and Carmelite,
Mm.
and I tend to work with people who are not necessarily identified with Christianity. I haven't found somebody that I think translate in a way that gets the essential pieces out. But the OCD tradition has some really great translations. That's the Order of Carmelites Discalced. OCD Publications would have some very interesting translations. And I would encourage anybody to really trust their gut,
Mm.
to really spend a few moments in silence. And as you read the first few words, take it as a honeymoon.
Mm.
See, does it liven you a bit? Is it drawing you in? Or are you finding yourself getting mental or even contracted in your body? And I would use that as a gauge to look into further exploration.
Well said. Yeah, and I'm curious if people are resonating with you and how would they find out more about your work?
I would, if you are resonating with me, I would love to work with you. You can jump on my website, kimberlybraun.com. I have online courses. I usually have a lot of retreats. I don't have as many, though. I'm doing some things on John of the Cross in Santa Barbara and LA next December around his feast day. So I'll be out there doing John work then. And I have an online spiritual community that is working with these essential truths as community from people who have attended retreats from all over the world. And I have online courses. So kimberlybraun.com, you can find out all that information, and you can email me from there too.
Well, thanks for joining me. That was a lot of fun. I just loved it. Yeah.
I did too. Thank you for all you shared. I'm so grateful for you and for the path you're walking.
Thank you so much. Likewise. Yeah. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
That would be lovely.
Yeah.
Maybe in person.
Wonderful. Thank you. So that was my conversation with Kimberly. If you'd like to find out more about the work that I offer, you can go to lenses.liberate.com, and I hope you enjoyed the show.